Norah Beck found the empty pasture before sunrise. She came through the frost with a lantern in one hand and a coffee tin in the other, expecting the low morning murmur of cattle waiting to be fed. Instead, she stopped at the north gate and heard nothing at all. 40 acres lay open and still. The chain had been looped back neatly. The herd had not stampeded. It had been let out, slow and careful, by somebody who knew cattle well enough to keep them quiet in the dark. Norah set the lantern down and crouched by the gate. Frost had been broken by many hooves, but there was order in the ground. Whoever took the herd had used the north draw where the cottonwoods swallowed sound. Then she saw the mark cut into the cedar post beside the latch, 3 short knife nicks, one under the other. Silas Creed made that mark when he whittled fence posts or saddle pegs. He had done it for years, careless in the way men become when nobody thinks to watch them. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. There is something good about knowing who is sitting by the fire with us. Norah rose, the cold biting through her skirt, and walked the fence line instead of running for the house. Running was for people who wanted comfort. She wanted proof. At the creek crossing, she found where cedar branches had been dragged to blur the trail. At the mud bank, she found the track of a horse with a slight short step on the left hind. Chester, Silas's bay gelding. By the time she reached the yard, the coffee in her tin had gone cold. Mrs. Varn, the cook, was hanging wash with the pinched mouth she wore when trouble was nearby. Silas says maybe the south herd drifted, and these followed. The south herd is still where I left it, Norah said. Silas came from the barn pulling on his gloves. He was a broad man with a patient face, the kind people trusted because it looked as if it had never been surprised by wickedness. He had ridden with Norah's husband Levi for 12 years. After Levi died in May from a fall, Silas had stepped into every space grief left open. He hired hands, rode to town, spoke to the bank. People had begun looking at him when they asked questions about the Beck place, as if widowhood had made Norah harder to see. He stopped a few paces from her. I was about to ride out, he said. No use frightening yourself before we know what happened. I know what happened. Do you? You moved my cattle through the north draw. Mrs. Varn froze with a sheet in her hand. Silas gave the small, sad smile he used on frightened colts and doubtful bankers. Norah, you are cold and angry and seeing shapes in dirt. I saw your knife marks on my gate. I cut half the posts on this ranch. And Chester's lame step at the creek. He's not the only horse in Wyoming with a short drop. No, she said. Just the only one I trusted enough not to watch. Something hard flashed behind his eyes and was gone so quickly another woman might have missed it. Norah did not. If I wanted to steal from you, he said smoothly, I would not leave my tracks where a child could read them. It was a fine answer. Almost fine enough. The sheriff arrived near noon. Harlan Tully smelled of saddle soap and tobacco and polished the same lens of his spectacles whenever he hoped trouble would solve itself. He rode the draw, studied the broken ground, then came back looking sympathetic. Could be rustlers, he said. It is rustlers, Norah answered. Only one of them sleeps in my bunkhouse. Tully glanced at Silas. He has a standing reputation. So did plenty of men who lied well. Silas lowered his voice, careful and sorrowful. She hasn't been herself since Levi passed. That cut deeper than shouting would have. Not because it was cruel, because it was useful. Norah went into the house and returned with Levi's herd ledger wrapped in oilcloth. She opened it on the kitchen table. These 48 head were due for sale next week, she said, running her finger down the page. Best weight on the ranch. Enough to clear the note and buy winter feed. Nobody knew that except me, Levi before he died, and Silas, because I asked him to tally with me on Sunday. Silas's jaw tightened, just once. These were not cattle taken at random, she said. They were chosen. The room fell silent. Wind scraped the eaves. Tully stared at the numbers as if they might rescue him from having to think. Then a voice came from the door. She is right. That herd was picked by somebody who can read a ledger as well as a trail. Gabriel Holt stood there with travel dust on his coat and a rawhide lead in one hand. He was lean, scarred from temple to jaw, and carried the wary stillness of a man who had been judged so long he had learned to save his words for things that mattered. Half the county distrusted him because he had once accused powerful men of altering brands and had the beating scars to show what had earned him. The other half distrusted him because they had heard the first half say they should. Sheriff Tully frowned. Nobody asked for your counsel. No, Gabriel said. But you look to need some. Norah had not spoken to him alone in over a year. She remembered the last true thing he had said to her at a church supper after Levi's funeral, when folks left him standing by himself near the coffee urn. People act like loneliness is catching. Now he looked at the ledger, then at her. If those cattle were marked for market, whoever took them will hide them fast. Rebrand by tomorrow if he can. Silas barked a laugh. You trust him? Gabriel turned. Better than the man already squeezing her throat. The words landed like a slammed door. Norah felt the choice open beneath her feet. If she accused Silas and failed, she would lose the ranch and whatever was left of her standing. If she kept trusting him because it was easier, she would lose the land Levi died believing was secure. She wrapped the ledger shut. Mr. Holt rides with me. Silas stepped forward. Norah. No, her voice stayed level. You can stay here and explain why your horse limps and why a blue corner is missing from your blanket. His face changed then, just enough to show the iron under the polish. You're making a mistake you cannot pull back from. I passed that gate at dawn, she said. Pulling back is over. They rode east because Gabriel said that was where a smart thief would go. Wesley Bell country, and everyone would search there first. East offered badlands, dry washes, abandoned line shacks, and a dozen places to hide a stolen herd until the brands were burned over. The day came on sharp and bright. Frost lifted into damp earth smell. Cottonwood leaves flashed pale in the wind. Gabriel rode as if he understood distance better than most men understood kindness, close enough to help, far enough not to crowd her. At the creek crossing, he swung down and studied the mud. 4 horses, 1 mule. They dragged branches until here, then stopped. Somebody in the bunch has a hurry on him. Norah found a brass tally tag half pressed into the bank, one Levi used only on sale cattle. She held it up. That wasn't dropped. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. No, it was left. Silas liked winning close enough to be seen. He always had. By evening they found the first living proof. A young calf had gone down in a wash and been abandoned. It was trembling and bawling weakly, wild with thirst. Norah was off her horse before Gabriel could speak. She knelt in the dirt, set one hand under the calf's jaw, and spoke to it in the low, steady voice she used for frightened stock. Easy now. Nobody's asking you for more than you've got. She checked its legs, mixed a little molasses with water from her canteen, and coaxed it to drink from her palm until its breathing settled. Gabriel watched in silence. At last he said, Levi knew what he had in you. The words caught her off guard because there was no surprise in them. Since Levi died, most praise had come wrapped in astonishment, as if competence in a woman were news. They camped in a cut bank above scrub pine. Over black coffee and hard biscuits, Gabriel asked, Why keep Silas after Levi passed? Norah stared into the fire. Because the morning after the burial the pump froze, the bank notice came, and one steer kicked through the garden fence. Silas stood in my yard and said, Leave the hard parts to me. I was tired enough to believe usefulness and goodness were the same thing. They aren't. No. She listened to the creek below them. Why help me? He turned his cup slowly by the rim. Because I know what it costs when everybody chooses the porch instead of the door. He said it so quietly, she almost missed the ache beneath it. Near midnight, he woke her with one hand on her shoulder. Hoofbeats. Faint, but coming fast from the south. 3 riders, maybe more. From the ridge, they saw them crossing the flat below, heading east. They're not searching for cattle, Gabriel said. They're searching for us. The easy path would have been turning back then, riding for town, placing the whole ugly thing in Sheriff Tully's soft hands, and hoping the law decided to be brave. The hard path led farther east into black country with armed men behind them. Tell me true, what would you have done in Norah's place? Would you have turned back toward safety, or ridden on with the one man the whole county warned you against? Norah swung into the saddle. If they're hunting us, we're close. Gabriel mounted beside her. Then let's stop being easy to follow. They rode through the Badlands by moonlight, down dry washes and over shelves of chalky stone. Once a shot struck rock close enough to sting Norah's cheek with grit. Neither of them wasted breath on fear. By dawn they found a thin thread of smoke rising where no smoke should have been. Gabriel crawled forward through sage and sandstone, then came back with his jaw set. Line shack in the wash. 8 men, maybe 10. Your cattle are boxed in below. They have irons in the fire. Norah closed her eyes for one heartbeat. Rebranding. By noon the herd would belong to anybody who had never seen it before. Silas. Gabriel nodded. And Amos Bell. That name struck like cold water. Amos Bell had tried twice to buy the Beck winter pasture from Levi and once from Norah after the funeral. Water ran there even in dry August. Men with too much money always wanted water that belonged to somebody weaker. He could have taken me to court, she said. Men like Bell prefer a widow with no witnesses. Below them the cattle bawled, thick with dust and fear. Men moved among them with ropes and poles. One iron glowed dull orange beside the fire. We need proof, Norah said. We need those cattle out first. Both. Gabriel studied her, measuring what she could carry. There's a narrow cut behind the canyon. If I turn the herd, they'll drive that way. You get to the shack. Look for bills of sale, brand papers, anything with Bell's name on it. Then get back to the cut. And if Silas sees me, shoot straighter than he does. They moved. Norah crawled to the shack, while Gabriel slipped downslope through the rocks. Dust coated the back of her throat. Inside the shack smelled of bacon grease, wet wool, and hot metal. On the table lay a bottle, greasy cards, and 2 folded papers weighed down by a coffee cup. She opened them with hands gone clumsy. One was a transfer contract for the Beck winter pasture, water rights included, to Amos Bell upon default of debt. The other promised payment to Silas Creed for discreet assistance in stock recovery and title settlement. Recovery. As though stealing a widow's herd and pressing her into default were only tidy business between gentlemen. Outside, cattle exploded into motion. Gabriel had turned them. Hooves thundered. Men shouted. Then over the chaos came Silas's voice, smooth even now. Take the widow first. Norah shoved the papers into her coat and jumped out the window, just as a bullet tore through the frame behind her. She hit the ground, rolled, and came up with Levi's rifle. Silas was already coming down the slope toward her with his revolver drawn, his face stripped at last of patience. So it was never enough to steal them, she said. You were meant to sign and leave, he answered. You made this troublesome. You killed Levi too? He did not flinch. Men fall from horses every day. That was answer enough. Their boy had died years earlier. Levi had carried that grief like a sack of stones. So had she. Now Silas reached into the oldest wound in their house and used it like a crowbar. Norah fired. The shot tore off his hat and scored his brow. He fired back. The bullet burned across her upper arm and spun her sideways. Pain flashed bright. She heard Gabriel shouting from the canyon mouth as the herd hammered toward the cut. Dust swallowed everything. Amos Bell appeared through it red-faced and cursing, trying to swing a shotgun while turning panicked cattle. Gabriel came at him from the flank on his blue roan and drove Bell's horse sideways into the churn. Bell hit the ground hard. The shotgun flew. Short, sharp, fast. Norah ran for the cut, and Silas caught her coat, dragging her backward. They crashed into the dirt. The rifle skidded away. He gripped her wounded arm, and pain nearly took her sight. You should have stayed grateful, he hissed. Up close she smelled coffee and blood on his breath. She saw it clearly then. All those years she had mistaken his steadiness for goodness. It had only ever been hunger without hurry. He raised the revolver. Norah drove the brass tally tag into his eye. He screamed and reeled. She shoved him hard toward the fire pit where the branding irons lay. He slipped in loose gravel, struck the iron rack, and kicked over one of Bell's coal pots. Fire rolled into the grease-soaked dirt. His sleeve caught. He stumbled blind and burning straight into Bell, who had just regained his feet with a knife in hand. Bell went down again under the weight of him and lost the knife in the dust. Gabriel swung Bell's shotgun level on the nearest hired hand. Drop it. Something in his voice emptied 3 pistols into the dirt. Sheriff Tully arrived 20 minutes later with 6 town men and the expression of a man who feared he had chosen the wrong side of a story. He found Norah on her feet, one arm bloodied, the Beck cattle bunched behind her in the wash, Bell with a broken collarbone, and Silas tied at the wrist with rawhide, one eye ruined, and all his calm burned clean away. Norah handed the sheriff the papers from her coat. Her blood had marked the edge of Bell's contract in one dark thumbprint. There's your reputation, she said. The ride home felt longer because the danger had changed shape. Violence was simple. Aftermath asked more of a body. By the time they reached the ranch, Norah's arm had stiffened and the fury in her chest had cooled into something heavier. Mrs. Varn heated water and cursed Bell, Silas, Sheriff Tully, and most of the male sex in one breath. When she left the kitchen to fetch clean linen, Gabriel sat across from Norah while she unwound the torn sleeve. The graze was ugly but not deep. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. He cleaned the wound carefully, as though roughness would be another kind of theft. Firelight touched the scar along his face. His hands were steady. She thought of all the years he had lived just outside the edges of town, judged by people who never once asked what it cost a man to outlive everyone he built a life for. "I should have known sooner," she said. "Maybe." He tied the bandage. "But grief makes familiar things look safer than they are. That isn't comfort." "No. Comfort is cheap when it isn't true." She looked at him, half wanting to laugh and half wanting to cry. "I trusted Levi's trust. That seems a poor sort of wisdom now." Gabriel rested his forearms on his knees. "A person can live a long time inside a room they built from one bad day," he said quietly. "The trick is noticing the door still works." Norah held his gaze. "And have you noticed?" For a moment, he only listened to the kettle muttering on the stove. Then he said, "Not until today." Later she found him on the porch under Levi's old coat with the moon white over the hill where Levi and little Daniel lay. She stood beside him in the cold and held out the brass tally tag. "I thought I'd keep it," she said. "Then I decided I'd rather remember something else." He took the tag in his palm. "What?" "That I was not as alone as I believed." His throat worked once. "Neither was I. If this part of the story is moving you tonight, then you are exactly who we write for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep bringing these stories home." Justice, once it finally started, moved with satisfying weight. Sheriff Tully read Bell's contract aloud in front of the bank agent, the town lawyer, 2 deputies, and half the county gathered outside the mercantile. Men who had nodded along to Bell for years suddenly found the dirt fascinating. One hired hand talked after learning Bell meant to leave them unpaid if trouble came. Another produced a note promising Silas extra money once Norah had been removed from the property. The bank agent from Laramie tried to insist the debt still stood. Norah laid Levi's ledger beside Bell's contract and pointed to the market prices for beef. "My cattle are recovered," she said. "My sale stands. What nearly broke this ranch was criminal interference. Unless the bank wants its name spoken beside Bell's in open court, it will extend terms until the herd clears market." He started to say that such matters were not usually argued by widows. "Then perhaps," Norah said, "it is time they were." By evening the extension was signed. The rest came faster than anybody expected. 2 neighboring ranchers filed complaints over missing yearlings and altered brands. Bell's leases were suspended. A clerk in Rollins produced records showing Bell had been buying notes on struggling spreads and pressing them into impossible terms. Once the first stone rolled, the whole hill came after it. Norah drove her recovered herd to Cheyenne herself, with Gabriel riding flank. Buyers noticed how she settled a skittish steer with 2 low words and a touch to the muzzle. They noticed how they addressed questions to Gabriel until he said, "Ask the woman who knows the cattle." They noticed, most of all, that she knew weights, bloodlines, and market timing better than men who had spent years speaking over her. She cleared the note, bought winter feed, paid the honest hands, and sent the rest away. By the time the trial opened in November, the Beck place was already standing straighter. Bell's lawyer tried to paint Norah as overwrought, Gabriel as unstable, and Silas as a loyal employee caught in confusion. Then Norah took the stand with Levi's ledger and the forged branding iron Bell Smith had made to turn the Beck mark into Bell's, with one added curl. She named each recovered beast by age, color, and flaw. 1 white-faced cow with a split right ear. 1 brindled steer scarred on the hock. 2 red yearlings with matching white socks behind. She spoke of calving dates, weight sheets, tally tags, and the hidden code she and Levi used on sale lots. Bell's lawyer objected twice, then sat down as if argument itself had become embarrassing. When Silas finally looked at her across the courtroom, there was no regret in his one good eye, only disbelief. He had never imagined she could outlast the story men told about her. The verdict took less than an hour. Guilty on every count that mattered. Bell lost the leases, the contracts, the bank favors, and by spring most of the spread he had used to bully half the county. Silas went to prison in Laramie with a patch over one eye and not a man willing to call him decent anymore. Sheriff Tully resigned the next year, claiming poor health. The town said little to his face and plenty after he passed. But the finest justice was quieter than the verdict. It lived in the way people began saying Norah's name. Men removed their hats and waited for her answer. Widows from neighboring places came asking how she handled the bank, and Norah spread the ledgers out on her kitchen table and taught them the language men used when they hoped women would stay confused. Mrs. Varn declared that if the county had any sense, it would put Norah in charge of every contract signed west of the river. As for Gabriel, he repaired the west fence without being asked, then built a calf shelter by the south pasture, then planted beans behind the kitchen because Mrs. Varn said any man welcome at her table ought to prove himself useful in daylight as well as dark. One evening in June, with cut grass in the air and swallows dipping above the yard, Norah found him resetting the stones around little Daniel's grave. "You needn't do that," she said. "I know." She stood beside him under the cottonwood. "I used to think grief was something you finished if you worked hard enough." Gabriel looked out over the ranch, the barns, the pasture, the creek flashing copper in the falling sun. "No," he said. "It just quits being the only room in the house." That was the second line worth carrying, and perhaps the truest. A week later, he kissed her under the porch eave with all the care of a man, returning something precious he feared the world had no right to keep. There was no grand announcement. Just two people who had buried too much and lived long enough to discover that tenderness, when it comes back, returns quiet and stubborn. Years later, folks would still tell the story for the justice of it. The widow wronged, the cattle stolen, the rich man ruined, the traitor exposed. But the truest part was smaller. When greedy hands reached for Norah Beck's home, she did not give up her land, her name, or the tenderness still living under all that scar tissue. She kept the whole of herself, and from that made a life no man could steal. 3 summers later, a little girl with Gabriel's dark eyes ran laughing between red calves in the evening light, while Norah, heavy with another child, watched from the pasture gate and listened to her husband lift their daughter onto the gentlest mare on the place. He looked toward the house, then toward the hill where the old grief still rested but no longer ruled, and Norah thought how strange it was that the heart, once given room, could carry both memory and joy without dropping either. The sun went down copper on the creek, and the whole ranch glowed like something the dark had tried and failed to take. Next time, come back for the story of the schoolteacher who married a dying miner to give him peace in his last days, only to learn the mountain he left her was worth far more than gold, and that the men who wanted it were willing to bury her with him.